Okay, welcome to Chapter 6, Cognitive Development in Infancy and Toddlerhood. And when we go through the chapters on cognitive development, we will uh, probably always start with Jean Piaget's cognitive development theory. Um, he's one of the leading theorists in cognitive development, not the only one, just another piece of the puzzle when we look at cognitive development. Kind of a big piece, but not the only piece of the puzzle when it comes to understanding cognitive development. But when we look at Piaget's stages, and remember he had four stages, through development. The one that we're going to look at for infancy is the sensory motor stage. And this is from birth to about 2 years old. This is the way that infants will come up with an organized way of making sense of experience called schemes. And so, all through Piaget's theories, actually, he talks about schemes or schemas. We kind of have scripts. For example, when um, young children, just for example, they live both at their mother's house and their father's house. They know what they're supposed to do at their mother's house, and when they go to their father's house, maybe there are different ways of doing things. And so, to make sense of their world, children will um, come up with schemas or scripts. This is what I do at mom's house. This is what I do at dad's house. And if they know what they're supposed to do, it's much easier for them to make up these scripts and behave accordingly. So, with infants, what they're looking at first are motor patterns, action based, and then they're going to move later on to mental thinking level. And so, with Piaget's theories, excuse me, we're always talking about changes in the quality of their thinking. So, with sensory motor development, they're going to move from just the reflexes to motor development to finally getting to mental thinking level. And how do we build those schemes? Well, first of all, if you look at Piaget's theory, he talks about adaptation. We are always building new schemes or schemas. We're always trying to make sense of our world as we construct our knowledge. And we do that through two different methods. One's assimilation and the other one is accommodation. And assimilation is when you take new information and fit it into existing knowledge. New information and fit it into existing knowledge. Accommodation is when you take new information and change existing knowledge. So it's just a different way of saying of what is on your screen. So, for example, if I learned how to drive an automatic car and the shifting was on the steering column, and then I borrow your car and you also have an automatic, but the shifting is on the floor. I can assimilate that new information of going from shifting with an automatic on the steering column to shifting on the floor in an automatic. It's still the same. But then if I borrow someone else's car and they have a 5 speed, well, then I have to go through accommodation, don't I? Because I'm going to take this new information of having now to learn how to do the clutch and the manual transmission. I'm going to have to change my existing knowledge about how to drive and accommodate this new information and come up with a new scheme. Here's another example. Think about a 2-year-old. If you give them a magnet, first of all, they're going to try to assimilate it into their current knowledge. They will probably put it in their mouth to see if it's something that tastes good. They're going to touch it to see if it has any texture. They might shake it to see if it makes any noise. They might throw it down to see if it does something interesting because that's what they have learned to do with objects. And if that's as far as they go with that magnet, then they're probably going to not play with that magnet too much, right? Because it really doesn't taste good, make noise, or, do anything very interesting. However, if they discover, which is what Piaget likes for them to do, but we can also show them that a magnet sticks to things. Oh, now accommodation takes place because now we can change our existing knowledge about what objects do, and especially with this particular magnet. What do they do with that magnet? They go all around trying to see what it sticks to, correct? And then when they get another new object, they have something new to do with that object. Does it taste good? Does it feel good? Does it make a noise? Does it do something interesting when you throw it on the floor? Or does it stick to things? You see how they change their existing knowledge. So that's what Piaget is always talking about. That's how children start to build schemes. It's either through assimilation or accommodation, but we're always changing and adapting through assimilation and accommodation. Very important kind of foundation of Piaget's theories that actually builds through the other stages as well. What children are trying to do is to establish equilibrium rather than disequilibrium. Um, Equilibrium occurs through assimilation when you can just take existing knowledge, excuse me, new information and fit it into existing knowledge. And disequilibrium, when something doesn't make sense or something's new, then that's going to prompt accommodation. We're going to have to change our existing knowledge. So Piaget is always talking about how children construct their own knowledge through adaptations using assimilation and accommodation, achieving equilibrium um, and or disequilibrium. So it's always this organization of constructing our knowledge and the internal rearranging and linking schemes. That's very important in understanding how children construct their knowledge. They link new information. So, in the sensory motor stage, birth to 2 years old, this is, a period of time where infants are going to build schemes through their senses and motor exploration because that's what they have, correct? They don't have language yet, so they can't think using language. They're not using logic and reasoning yet, but they certainly have senses and they have motor skills. So that's why we call it the sensory motor stage. And again, you're going to see a change in the quality of the thinking from birth to 2 years old. What Piaget is going to talk about in this stage is something we called circular reactions. This is when he describes it as stumbling upon a new experience caused by the baby's own motor activity. So through their motor activities, they're going to move from just exploring themselves to exploring the outside world. So Piaget's sensory motor stage has 6 substages that you need to understand. The first substage is for about the first month, and he says basically it's the newborn reflexes. So we've already talked about those newborn reflexes, and that's how the infant is thinking and using their senses and motor skills. Someone will touch their lips, then that means they're supposed to suck because they have that sucking reflex. Or if the side of their cheek is stroked, they will turn that way looking for food. So those are the reflexes, and that's how they start to fit into their world using those reflexes. And then 1 to 4 months, they start to go through what he calls primary circular reactions. These are simple motor habits centered around the infant's own body. Primary circular reaction. So who's the primary? The infant is the primary. So they're just interested in figuring out that they are a body. And so lots of times they will kind of hold their hands. They wring their hands. They might be touching their feet. They bring their feet up and touch their feet. It's all about who am I? I'm a body here. So it's all about their own primary circular reactions. If you introduce an object to them, yes, they might grab it because they still have a reflex sometimes for grasping till about 3 or 4 months, but they really don't play with it, they don't interact with it. correct because it's the primary circular reactions. Then as they move into the secondary circular reactions, 4 to 8 months, now they understand that, I can interact with the world outside of me. And so, yes, you've given them that object, and so maybe they just kind of, move around and it, makes noise. If you gave them, for example, a set of keys or a rattle, they just kind of not just move that one arm, but maybe move both arms and their legs, and boy, that rattle then makes noises, doesn't it? Um, Same thing with, for example, that mobile that you have up over their crib, and that they might be lying on their back looking at it. And they just kind of start thrashing around their arms and their legs, and gosh, the mobile moves as they bounce in that bed. And they're not quite sure at this point what it is that they are doing that makes that interesting effect. But you know what? I'm going to keep trying and see if I can figure it out. And then they move into, at age 12 months, coordination of secondary circular reactions. And so this means now they're going to have intentional or goal-directed behavior. So it's the coordination of secondary circular reactions. Now they are going to have goal-directed behavior. For example, not only do I take blocks and stack one on top of the other. Why am I doing that? It's because then my next behavior is to knock them down. So I'm going to build it up so I can knock it down. That's an intentional goal-directed behavior that we start to see between 8 and 12 months old. We also start to see something called object permanence at this time, and that's understanding when something is not visible, it still exists. And there's a whole object permanence activity that we can do with infants where we partially hide something, see if they can find it. And then we hide it in a second place. They always look in the first place first. And then we might hide it under a number of things. And then eventually they're going to look at it and mentally figure it out, but that's not going to happen until the last stage. So I'll talk more about that in a minute. So we have this coordination of secondary circular reactions, putting together intentional or goal-directed behavior. And then in the fifth stage, it's called tertiary circular reactions, 12 to 18 months. So now there's the exploration of the properties of objects by acting on them in novel ways. Imitation of unfamiliar behaviors, ability to search in several locations for a hidden object. This is, I think, probably one of the most interesting substages of sensory motor development. You know how they're sitting in their high chair, and you might have a bowl of SpaghettiOs in front of them, and then a Tommy Tippy cup of milk. And they might pour the milk into the SpaghettiOs. And they kind of laugh, and you say, "Oh gosh." And what do? You dump out those SpaghettiOs, give them a new bowl and a new uh, Tommy Tippy cup of milk. And then they might do it again and again because they want to see if it will still happen. They're experimenting. Um, Sometimes they just might throw that Tommy Tippy cup on the floor, and what do? Pick it up. They throw it down again. What do? Pick it up. So they're experimenting. They're interested in, what's going to happen. You know that one toy, and it's a very good toy. It's like a cube, and it has different cutout shapes, and then you have the little plastic cutout shapes, and you have to find the right shaped hole in order to get the plastic object in the cube box. Well, at this point, what they do is they just take the plastic shape and they just kind of poke all over and see if they get lucky and it fits inside. But then they move into the last stage of sensory motor development, mental representation, 18 months to 2 years. Now they're starting to stop and think before they actually do something. So with that cube, you see them hold the um, shaped object in their hand. They look at it, and for example, if it's a triangle, they look at the object, then they hold the box and they actually turn the box around looking for that same shape before they try to put it in. So you see that mental representation that's going on? So it's these internal depictions of objects and events. They start to solve problems mentally first. Think about that and think about where we went in the first 2 years of life in their cognitive development, in their thinking. So we have gone from reflexive schemes, just the reflexes, to figuring out their own body, to figuring out they have some kind of interaction and effect on the world outside of their body, to figuring out they can have goal directed behavior, to figuring out, hmm, what is it that I do, that makes something else happen? Will it happen over and over and over again? And then to the point of figuring it out mentally before they move on. So object permanence that we know begins back at, if we looked at again, we can see object permanence beginning in that fourth stage of coordination of secondary circular reactions, not really complete until the final stage, but somewhere between 8 and 12 months to 2 years old, they will start to understand what we call object permanence. And Piaget talked about this, and it's understanding that objects continue to exist when out of sight. So, according to Piaget, it's going to develop in about substage 4. It's incomplete at first, that they um, don't always, as I said, the task is you. If I were to take like a set of keys and hide it under a pillow and it's only partially hidden so they could see it. Well, somewhere between 8 and 12 months, if I say, "Where are the keys?" they will see the keys and be able to, lift up the pillow and find them. But then if I take the keys and I put them under a different pillow and say, "Now, where are the keys?" They usually go back to the first pillow first to look, then they go to the second pillow. And then if I were to take like 3 pillows and put the keys underneath, when they finally get to mental representation, you can see them stop and look and almost take the pillows off mentally before they actually take the pillows off and pick up the keys and giggle and rattle them and say, "Here they are." So that's object permanence. Um, there have been some subsequent research after Piaget, and so, for example, Balagian and her collaborators claim to have found evidence for object permanence in the first few months of life. And one of the things with Piaget's theories, we do understand that these are important theories in understanding cognitive development, but his timing may have been off on some of them. And so some critics question whether babies' looking preferences tell us what they really know. And we do know that mastery of object permanence is a gradual achievement. It doesn't come all of a sudden, but it's gradual. Another example of object permanence, you may have left your baby at a daycare provider. You had to go back to work shortly after the baby was born, and you leave the baby at the daycare provider, no problem. And then all of a sudden, your baby, somewhere around 8 months old, 6, 7, 8 months old, when you leave them, they start to cry. Now you might think, "Oh gosh, what's happening here? They don't like being left here." But that's not it. What they're realizing is, hey, just because you're gone, I know you exist. And they're just expressing that. Um, this is just looking at violation of expectation method, so habituation events, looking at the short carrot versus the tall carrot, looking at um, the second one. Do you see the difference between the expected event and the unexpected event? a little bit more about mental representations, internal mental depictions of objects, people, events, information. That what they're basically doing is starting to think and manipulate with the mind. This allows for what we call deferred imitation and make-believe play. I mean, when they go into your closet and get those clothes out, they're actually thinking, aren't they? I'm going to put the hat on. Let's see, I'll grab that purse, and the beads. And so that's what, they're thinking when they get into make believe play. They don't do make believe play at 1 year old usually because they're not yet there in cognitive thinking where they can think about make believe play. Deferred imitation is when they see something and then they will imitate it later on. So Piaget says that deferred imitation occurs somewhere around 18 months, but newer research says it can occur in different forms much, much earlier. At 6 weeks, facial imitation, and they have research where they will show the mother perhaps sticking the tongue out at the infant, and you'll see the infant starting to stick out their tongue. And 6 to 9 months, copy actions um, just maybe different expressions, or if you show them how to do something, then they will copy that. 14 months imitate rationally where they're thinking, and 18 months imitate intended but not completed actions, and so that they can anticipate what might come next. This just looks at problem solving um, with infants, so they're trying to figure out in this particular slide, trying to figure out how to get the object to them. So they have to think about, if they pull the string, for example, the object will come. Oops. I'm sorry. Got a couple of those slides mixed up a little bit. As you can tell, these are not the most professional videos or lectures, but anyway, let's move on to some cognitive attainments of infancy and toddlerhood. So, in addition to Piaget's theory, we're looking at some of the cognitive developments that occur from birth to 2 years old, and some of these include Piaget's theory and also some other things. So you can read through this and again look at the changes in the quality of thinking from using the reflexes and such as sucking, um, going on to awareness of object properties and starting to understand a little bit about deferred imitation, um, going into the 4 to 8 months where there's um, they do understand just a little bit about that violation of expectation findings and deferred imitation of adults' actions, and then moving into the ability to search for a hidden object, into much more deferred imitation, and then when you get into 18 months to 2 months, looking again at mental problem solving abilities and just imitation of everyday behaviors and make believe play. Looking at the sensory motor stage, some developments happen at the time Piaget described, such as object search, A not B, and make believe play. But many appear to happen sooner than Piaget thought. And a lot of this has to do with just new research that has come out and new research we have about brain development. Um, so we just know a lot more about what infants know now than we did when Piaget did his research, but he certainly paved the way for understanding how we start to construct our own knowledge. And one of the other theories that we look at in cognitive development, if you remember from the first chapter, is looking at the information processing system, where you have to have an input of information, be able to store that information either in long term or short term memory, and then be able to retrieve the information. And so even in infancy, they're starting to process information. And many times, how they do that has to do with repetition. When you do something over and over again, they do remember what they need to do. And it's also part of forming those schemas. When we talk about cognitive development in all the stages, we'll also talk about attention because when we look at the process of paying attention to something, we are also looking at cognitive development because it is what's going on in the mind, correct? So during that first year, infants pay attention to novel events. So when something new happens or something kind of a surprise, they do pay attention to it, don't they? They look at it, they might laugh, they react to it. And during toddlerhood, children become capable of intentional behavior and sustained attention improves. It means that they can pay attention to something longer. Where this is a very important part of cognitive development, as we'll talk about throughout the semester. Memory is also another part of cognitive development. And if we just look at the operant conditioning research, it shows that infants' memories increase dramatically during infancy and toddlerhood. So they move from highly context dependent to increasingly context free. So at first it's just, context dependent. For example, when they see the breast, then they know it's time to eat. Context free would be when they get to the point of wanting to eat, even though they don't see the breast. And habituation recovery research confirms that infants do not need to be physically active to acquire and retain new information. So the environment is going to be very important. Um, and infants can engage in recall by the end of the first year. Um, Two aspects of memory that we look at are recognition and recall. And recognition is when, here's the task that you can use. And we most likely use this particular task in early childhood more so than infants, but it will illustrate recognition and recall. If you show them 5 objects, and if you were to um, uh, take 3 of those objects away, put 3 new ones in, they would be able to recognize which ones are new and which ones were already there. Recall would be when you would take away all 5 objects and ask them to tell you what they are. So that's the difference between recognition and recall. We do know that recognition is easier, but there's some research that's showing in their own way infants can even engage in recall by the end of the first year, by 2 years old. Increase in retention in 2 operant conditioning tasks from 2 to 18 months. This looks at a mobile task and a trained task, and you can see how their retention increases as they get older so that they can remember and they put into memory how to do certain things. That's all this is telling us. Categorization, putting into groups. By 6 months, infants can categorize based on 2 features, shape and color. The earliest categories are perceptual, but by the second half of the first year, more categories are conceptual rather than perceptual. And so, 2-year-olds, they start to group things. You might see where they'll put things all together with the maybe all by color. If they have different groups of blocks, for example, as shown in this picture, you see that he's making a pattern, isn't he? He's got 1 blue, 2 orange. Now he's going to put 1 blue, and next he would put 2 orange. And so that means they are able to categorize when you see them do that. Lev Vygotsky, sociocultural theory, and again, a very important theorist that we now value his theories in understanding child development. He talks about social context and zone of proximal development. Social context, which means their relationships, the child's relationships to other people contribute to cognitive development. So the more social context or social interactions that a child has, um, that helps in their cognitive development. Whether they are a baby and they're interacting with a peer, or they are interacting with an adult, or even an older child, the same context of interacting with others. That social context is very important in helping us think, helping us construct our knowledge. Um, Vygotsky talks about the zone of proximal development, and these are tasks the child cannot do alone but can learn to do with help. So, for example, if you have a young child who, if we went back to that last picture where the child was had the blue blocks and the orange blocks, maybe first of all they just start by putting all the blue blocks together and all the orange blocks together. If you are right there and perhaps have your own blocks and you start to make a pattern and you might want to say it out loud, I'm going to put a blue block and then I'm going to put two orange blocks and then I'm going to put a blue block. Then you'll see that that child says, I could do that too. And they start to make a pattern. So it's that, they have already started to categorize by color, but having someone just right there to, um, you know, show them the next step of cognitive thinking, the next step in constructing their knowledge, they are going to move from the lower end of a skill of being able to categorize by color to the upper end of the skill. Not only can I categorize by color, but I can also make a pattern out of these particular colors. So Vygotsky's theory, that zone of proximal development, is very important. So often I know that we let children, do things on their own, and that's good, but being right next to them really does help. Just looking at this picture of the two children eating, they are learning from each other, just that social interaction. Perhaps they'll learn, we have two children here. Look at that picture. What do you think they're going to learn? You can see that they both have chopsticks. One child is using a spoon, the other child just the chopsticks. And so perhaps, and she has a spoon also in her dish, but they're learning to use the chopsticks in the interim using the spoon. And so they're in the midst of learning a new skill between the two of them. They'll watch each other, they'll talk about it, and they will learn. It's the social context. Looking at an infant intelligence test, how can we measure infant intelligence? Well, we do have various ways of doing it. That Nancy Bailey came up with the Bailey scales of infant development that have been very, very instrumental in understanding how infants' intelligence develops. And so her tests are suitable for children between 1 month and 3.5 years old. And she has different um, categories in the Bailey scales, where she's going to look at the cognitive development, language development, motor development, socio-emotional, and adaptive behavior scale. But there are ways that basically what she is looking at, you can see with the motor scale, means that she's going to look at physical development. She wants to make sure, um, or when this test is used, you want to make sure that the infant is developing according to the physical norms, that they're reaching those milestones. That's very important, because if that's happening, that means there is proper brain development going on. We'll look at language, that certainly we should see some progression in language development during infancy, where they start off with the sounds and go to the one word, two word stage, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Looking at their behavior, if they, are exhibiting appropriate behavior, because basically what are we doing? We are looking at the whole child, physical, cognitive, and social development. And if they are developing according to the norms, then we're sure that their intelligence is also developing. We don't use the Bailey scales with all children, all babies. Which infants do you think we would be most concerned with, um, you know, looking at and determining their intelligence using the Bailey scales? If you're thinking about preterm infants, premature infants, this is one of the scales that we might use to see when they catch up to where they're supposed to be, or we use them with infants who might have been prenatally exposed to substances to see where they are in their infant development. So we don't usually use it with all children, but we do use it with children that we might have some concerns. We'll talk. This is looking at normal distribution of intelligence test scores. Um, the IQ of 100, do we know that that happens, in an infant? No. When we look at the IQ scores, basically, we're going to be much more concerned with the actual scores when we look at um, child development later on, when we look at the middle and late childhood years, for example. Then we're going to be much more concerned about intelligence test scores using typical IQ kinds of tests, which we'll talk more about later. What we are concerned about with infants and their cognitive development, their intelligence development, we know that home environment is very, very important. So we want to analyze, the parent emotional and verbal responsiveness. Do we have parents that, comfort children when they need comforting? Do we know? Um, do the parents speak to the infant so that they can hear language, so that they can develop their language? We look at parental acceptance of the infant. We look at, and you might think, well, of course. No, not so much. Some parents are not as emotionally connected and do not accept their child as much as others. And infants recognize that right away, don't they? We want to make sure there's a safe physical environment, appropriate play materials, for example, that they're not stuck in front of a TV all day, that there are play materials just like the that cube that I mentioned earlier with the shapes, any kind of play um, materials and activities that encourage cognitive development is very, very important. Puzzles, um, we want to make sure that there's some kind of parental involvement, that parents get down on that floor and play with their infants, and that variety and daily stimulation, and that we're very concerned about habituation and dishabituation. When we look at child care, and we do have to consider child care in our um, American culture. There are over 2 million children under the age of 5 in child care every day. We really want to look at the quality of child care, and we hope that we have developmentally appropriate child care, and there are certain guidelines we can follow. And most of these guidelines are produced by the NAEYC, which is the National Association for the Education of Young Children, a very important professional organization that many of you who do go into early childhood education will at some point join this organization, I'm sure, but they've been very instrumental in providing the policies and guidelines for a number of issues in early learning and care. And so they have come up with policies that are um, widely accepted. And so what we're looking at is that we want responsive, interactive, well-trained caregivers. Just because a caregiver is licensed does not mean that they've had education in child development. Just a licensed home care, all they have to have is, if they need to get the license, they need to have infant and early childhood CPR and first aid training, um, a few hours of health and safety, and basically that's all they have to have. You know, they get inspected for having a safe environment, but the caregiver doesn't really have to be trained. Now, certainly, if I was going to leave my infant somewhere, I'd want a well trained caregiver. I'd want them to at least have had this class, don't you think? So anyway, we want to look at that well-trained caregivers. We want clean, safe, uncrowded indoor spaces. And so we want to make sure that, especially for infants, they have floor time, which means that there is a safe environment, clean floor where they can learn to crawl, where they can learn to climb, appropriate um, play equipment that help them develop those physical skills. Um, we want to have, appropriate toys, safe equipment, low teacher-child ratios. With infants, no more than 5 to 1. The lower the ratio, the better. And 5 to 1 would include infants to um, 2-year-olds, and so you wouldn't want 5 infants at once. Um, you really want to look at that low teacher-child ratio, flexible daily schedule, a warm, caring atmosphere where parents are welcome anytime. Um, Basically, you want to make sure that that child care center or family home care provides the kinds of activities that are going to promote physical, cognitive, and social development for children. Accredited, there can some centers are accredited by the NAEYC, which means they have passed a number of really tough criteria um, in order to get that rating. And so that means usually that's a very high quality center if they have been accredited. When we look at IQ improvement from early intervention programs, look at this. We have treatment and the control group that didn't receive treatment. What does this mean, early intervention? This means that for infants and young children that are in environments that don't have the kinds of characteristics that we've just been talking about. Perhaps they're in a very adverse situation, not just only living in poverty, but maybe having parents that aren't responsible and aren't taking care of them. If we can intervene early, the earlier we can intervene, the more likely we're able to help that child. The later we intervene, we're not going to make as much of a change, even though we can still make a change in their lives and in their intelligence development. But early intervention is very, very important. We have what's called Early Head Start. We've heard of Head Start programs. We'll talk about those later on in early childhood development, but those are usually for 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. But we have Early Head Start, which began in 1995. Regular Head Start programs began in 1965. But right now, currently is around 700 sites serving around 62,000 low-income families. Certainly not as many families that are eligible, so it's only serving a small amount of those eligible families. But we do find with Early Head Start, we can have those early intervention practices begin, and it helps the child, it helps the family. One thing that we know with Head Start programs um, is that they also have the family component. So it helps the parents and the family as well as the child. And when we can do that, then we're helping that child. Their cognitive, their language development are going to increase, and so is their socio-emotional development as well as physical development. Language development. This is one of my favorite subjects to talk about in cognitive development. And so basically, we're going to have 3 different theories. We've got the behaviorist theory that says all language is learned through reinforcement and imitation, and that's like a theorist such as B.F. Skinner. And then we have the nativist view. Noam Chomsky is one of these theorists, and this particular view looks at The language acquisition device, LAD. We are born to learn language. So it's that nature part. We have all the parts. We have the vocal cords, we have the larynx, we have the brain developed to learn language. So we have the language acquisition device. And so it biologically prepares infants to learn the rules of language. The interactionist viewpoint looks at our inner capacities and environment working together. So it's just a combination, basically, of learning behavior or learning language through hearing it, through imitating it, and being able to speak it because of our language acquisition device and going through the specific rules of learning language. Looking at this nativist view, we know that the brain is wired for language development. We have Broca's area, which is located in the left frontal lobe, and that's the part that's going to support grammatical processing and language production. We have Wernicke's area, which is located in the left temporal lobe, and it plays a role in comprehending word meaning. So we know that the left hemisphere of the brain is basically where we're going to find language development. This just looks at the different parts of the brain important in language development, important from the very beginning, because wiring for language is done from day one in that infant's brain. Even though they're not going to be able to speak for another year or so, they are already hearing language, hopefully. So we need to be speaking to infants constantly. Um, Recent ideas about language development emphasize that interactions are very important in developing language development, because so that our social interactions between that infant and adults and others, that's that that's the behaviorist view, because they're going to hear language and they're going to imitate the language that they hear, but that's going to stimulate the inner capacities of that nativist view where the brain is being developed. So the wiring is taking place. That's, I just, just can't emphasize how important it is that we speak to infants. Too often I see parents who have infants in infant seats, and they just put them in front of TVs and they don't really speak to them. It's because, well, they're not going to speak back, and so they don't speak to them. Think about it. When you have that baby down and you're changing their diaper, talk to them. Oh gosh, look, oh gosh, we got a really dirty diaper today, don't we? And you look at their face and they're listening to you, aren't they? They're listening to every word you say, and you can go on and say, oh gosh, I listened to Lopez's lecture today. It was kind of a long one. I didn't think it was going to end, but you know what? I learned I need to talk to you. And that infant might start smiling. They are definitely listening to you. They're not speaking back at you yet, are they? But they're listening, because that language is being wired into their brain. They're already hearing the language that they're going to imitate when they are physically ready to speak, but it has to be in the brain. We do know also, to support this nativist view, that language needs to be learned before puberty. That there are a couple of cases that are in your book: girl named Jeannie, the boy from Avalon, who were raised away from people, didn't hear language when they were rescued. Um, they were taught to communicate, but neither one of them could really learn how to speak, because that part of the brain, the synapses, the dendrites, was just kind of like already shut off. And so it was hard to learn language. We do know that once you learn one language, it's easier to learn another language. Um, So, we know certain things about the brain. We know that, for example, um, if we know that timing is very important. As I mentioned, you have to learn language before puberty. It's also uh, easier to learn a language and learn how to speak it in the proper accent if you learn it before puberty. So, for example, if someone was to come to the United States from another country and they came here when they were maybe 5 or 6 years old, or as long as it's before puberty, they learn English and they can speak it without the accent of their primary language. If they move here after adolescence, yes, they learn language because remember, once you learn one language, you can always learn another language. Um, but after puberty, they will speak English often with the accent of their primary language. Even, just people who move around the United States, we have such different accents in different geographical areas in the United States. So if someone moves from the southern part of the United States to California, if they move as a young child before puberty, they probably will lose that southern accent. If they move after puberty, they probably will retain some of that southern accent. So, that's all the nature part. We know that in young children, if they have an injury to the left hemisphere of the brain, because the brain is still developing, the right side of the brain will take over language and they'll be able to um, learn language and speak. But if you look at an elderly person, if they have a stroke, for example, in the left hemisphere of the brain, they usually lose the ability to speak. So we just know there's so much of this nature part, but we will talk about how important social interaction is in learning language. And so let's look at the milestones of language development in the first 2 years. So, somewhere around 2 months, they're starting to communicate, aren't they? They coo. Have you ever heard a baby coo? Oh, those are pleasant sounds. It's like, ooh, ooh, ooh. They're cooing. Maybe I don't coo very well, but you know what a baby cooing. They're usually happy. Often after you give them their bath, they make those sounds. They're communicating. They also communicate through crying, don't they? 6 months and on, then they'll start to babble, and they usually add consonants to those cooing sounds. So, and they repeat the syllables: ba ba ba, na na na, da da da. And by 7 months, the babbling starts to include many sounds of spoken language, so such as ma 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 da da da. So you might start to hear those kinds of sounds. That's important. I'm going to talk about phonetic awareness, and so it's important that they are using those consonants and vowel sounds, and that it's we might even say a little bit back. We might go, oh, ba 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 ba, and see if they can, you know, imitate that. They observe with interest as the caregiver plays turn-taking games such as pat a cake and peekaboo. Even though they're not speaking yet, let's say after the bath, you have this little game every night or morning, whenever you play with them, that you take that towel that you're drying them up with and you put it in front of your face and you drop it and you go peekaboo, and they laugh and giggle, right? Well, all of a sudden, what they also do is they'll pick up the towel and they'll drop it. And even though they can't say peekaboo, they might babble some kind of sound, and then you laugh and laugh and laugh. And that's an also important part of social interaction and social development that we'll talk about later. 8 to 12 months, they'll start to comprehend some words. So even though they may not be able to say it, you know, they will comprehend it. So you can say, "Oh, are you hungry? Do you want to eat?" Or they'll start to understand, "Go, let's go." Those kinds of words, and they become much more accurate at establishing joint attention with the caregiver. And so, they might even start to point. And so, what you need to do is to label. Oh, would you like your blanket? Would you like your bottle? Because that's part of that behaviorist view. When we start to um, role model for them the kind of language we want them to hear. So when they point to something, we label it. Then, as soon as they are developmentally able, they can say that word. But you see, it gets wired into their brain. The vocabulary gets wired in. Now they might actively participate in those speaking games, as I just mentioned with peekaboo. They might also use pre-verbal gestures, not just pointing, but if you've read anything about baby signs, there are a couple of researchers from Davis who have um, figured this out, did a lot of research a few years ago, and have written a few books and do quite a bit of training on baby signs. We know that babies can learn how to gesture and use signs. Often these are signs from the American Sign Language. Um, and so they can communicate before they can speak. And so there are certain signs they can use for eat, for hungry, for more. It's very, very interesting because they are communicating, and they are speaking, but they're speaking using gestures or signs, not words yet, because they're not developmentally ready yet. 12 months. Those babblings now include sound and intonation patterns of the child's language community, so that they're starting to use um, some of the sounds and patterns that they hear. So the kinds of language that we use with them is what they're going to imitate. Somewhere around a year old, they usually say their first recognizable words. So they usually go from one word. Um, so we've gone from pre-verbal stages of babbling to one word, which we call a hollow phrase, because this first word is usually um, a hollow phrase. It means that one word means everything. They can say up, and that means pick me up and hold me, please. Go. Come on, let's go. Let's go to Grandma's house. Eat. I'm hungry and I'd like for you to fix maybe some lasagna for dinner. So they're just one word, the hollow phrase. And then you'll see that in that second year of life, their vocabulary is starting to expand very quickly. And by about 2 years old, they should be using two words together, and that's called telegraphic speech. They leave out unimportant words. And so they might say, Daddy home, because daddy and home, those would be the two important words. They leave out my daddy is home now. They leave out all those unimportant words, and they're just going to say daddy home. They might say doggy bark. And so they're leaving out, the doggy is barking. Now, what we want to do is to role model for them the kind of language we want them to speak. So we don't repeat after the 2 year old, doggy bark. No, we want to repeat, and we want to use age appropriate language. We wouldn't say, yes, the canine is exercising his vocal cords, but we might want to say, yes, the dog is barking. He's barking loudly, isn't he? So you see, we want to role model the kind of language we want them to speak. We don't want to just keep repeating what they say, because then we're keeping them at that particular stage. So if you think of Vygotsky's theory and of zone of proximal development, that ties into this also, because what we are doing is role modeling, moving that child from the bottom level of being able to put two words together to putting three or four words together. And this is called the mean length of utterance. It's the number of words they can put together in a sequence. That's much more important than just um, how old they are and whether or not they're speaking. What we want to see is that they are progressing in their language development from the pre-verbal to one word to two word to three to four words, etc. So, just kind of as a review, getting ready to talk, we have the first speech sounds of cooing and babbling. Then they start to actually communicate, where they get your attention. There's that give and take and pre-verbal gestures. Sensitive period for language development. We know that a deaf-born 5-month-old given a cochlear implant showed typical infant babbling and resembled her hearing age mates in language development at 3 to 4 years old. We also know that deaf children in general learn to sign and go through the same stages as a hearing child, except for they're using sign language instead of spoken words. If hearing is not restored until after age 2, then you're going to see some language delays. And in this particular study, if implantation occurs after age 4, language delays are severe and persistent. So again, we're looking at early intervention. Starting to talk, sometimes those first words are underextension and overextension. Overextension is when they would use the word doggy for all four-legged animals. Two-word utterances, and so we see children using a steady, continuous increase in the rate of their word learning through the preschool years. Once they get past 2 years old and they do start to speak, their language should explode. And so we go from that one word um, under extension to the telegraphic speech of 2 words, and then boy, it just goes from there to 3 to 4 words, 4 to 5 words. And so we want to role model those different stages for them, because I cannot emphasize too much how important verbal language development is. For example, it's so important in later um, as they get into the preschool years and into kindergarten, and it's time for them to learn how to read, because those children that have very good verbal skills, it's going to be much easier for them to learn how to read than a child who is still at 2 and 3 words in a sentence, or not using the proper words, not pronouncing the words correctly. Because if they have good verbal skills, they're pronouncing words correctly, they're already putting 4 to 5 words together in a sentence, in a phrase, then all they have to do when they learn how to read is learn how to decode um, the words, the sounds, the phonics. But if they're behind in their language development, they're having to speak words that aren't in their vocabulary, and they're having to put more words together in a phrase that they're not used to doing. So verbal language is going to be so important. And we do know that those toddlers in the second year of life acquire concrete pieces of language. So they gradually generalize to construct word order and grammatical rules of their native tongue. And so every language actually has rules of language development, where you move from um, the phonemes, the phonetics, just sounds, and then you move to using, once you start to use words, then you learn the uh, small units of language, which are morphemes, where you add an S on things, for example, to make it plural. You increase your use of syntax, learning the grammar, the proper sequence, the semantics, your vocabulary increases, and lastly, you'll get to pragmatics, which is the social context use of language, which doesn't often come until 3 to 5 years old. And so we know that comprehension versus production, um, it increases dramatically in that second year, and that quick comprehension frees space in working memory for picking up new words and for the demanding task of using them to communicate. There are some differences in language development. There are a few studies that show girls tend to speak earlier than boys, not always. We do know temperament can make a difference. Those infants that have a outgoing temperament um, are much more likely to speak sooner and more often than those that have the more shy, withdrawn temperament. Um, Environment, socioeconomic status, those from higher socioeconomic status tend to increase their vocabulary much quicker than those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Child-directed speech is very important. And so that's the parent interaction. So parents who will echo and expand on a child's um, language are more likely to have children who pick up language quicker and develop their language a little bit more fully. Um, the kind of language style that is used around them how expressive it is. Children, hear words that have emotion. We are concerned about language delay, and that's going to be children who are not developing their language development. Supporting early language development in infants in the first year, we want to respond to coos and babbles. When they're cooing, we want to talk to them, go, oh, you just smell so good after your bath. You're such a happy baby. When they're babbling, as I mentioned, ba ba ba, da da da, establish and respond to that joint attention so that, they pay attention to you. When you speak, you pay attention to them when they are babbling and cooing, and you play those social games. That's part of language development. With toddlers in that second year, play make believe with them, have conversations with them, read to toddlers. And again, I can't emphasize how important that is. You want to be reading to children because each time you read, you are role modeling language, aren't you? You're role modeling phrases, sentences. You're role modeling expressiveness of language. And when you read to them and you talk about the books, there's so much development going on. And, you do this in a developmentally appropriate way. You don't, ask the child about, gosh, well, look at the character development in this book. No, you just say, oh, gosh, this, um, you know, in Jack and the Beanstalk, Jack is, the he's afraid in this part, isn't he? Or well, what do you think he's feeling? So you just talk about it. Very, very important. That parent-child interaction, again, the impact on language is very, very important. Um, some of the research about 1 in every 1,000 infants in North America is born deaf. Over 90% of these children have hearing parents who are not fluent in sign language. Deaf parents of hearing parents, Deaf children of hearing parents are often delayed in development of language and make believe, play, and have deficient social skills. Yet children of deaf parents do not have these problems. Think about that. Intervention within the first year of life can have a positive impact on language, cognitive, and social outcomes for deaf children of hearing parents.